Morning, everybody. I'm Jonathan from Nimonik, and thank you so much for joining us. It's 10 o'clock Eastern Time, and hopefully everybody's tech is getting set up. If you want to go grab yourself a coffee or just arrange the room or your office space, go for it. I think we'll just give people a few minutes to log on, get everything set up, and we'll start in maybe 2 to 3 minutes. While we're waiting for more folks to join, because we do have about 500 registrants from around the world. So I think there's a lot of people still logging in. There's a number of things. So there's handouts in the right-hand panel in the GoToMeeting system. You'll see there's a tab called Handouts. And in there, we have the workbooks, both in Excel format and PDF format, as well as a couple other presentations that kind of just put everything into context. We are limited to 5 handouts, so we tried to pick the 5 most helpful ones. I'll talk a little bit more later about other resources that we have available for you. But please go ahead and download those handouts. The workbooks that in there are the same ones that were emailed out with your registration email. So if you already have them, it's the same thing. And there's a chat window on the right-hand side as well. So there's a chat you can put in questions, comments, thoughts in there, and we'll try and interact and make this as interactive a webinar as possible. We also have a questions panel. So on the right-hand side, you also have a tab for questions. So please feel free to put questions in there. With the amount of people we have, it might be a little bit tricky to just get to everybody's question in the right order, but we'll do our best, and we're going to try and answer questions sort of as we get to the relevant parts of the workshop today. So I'm going to let a few minutes, maybe 2 more minutes for more folks to join. I still see people logging in, and if you want to grab yourself a coffee, go for it. One of the most common questions is about the recording, and so yes, we will provide a recording of this workshop to you. But because it's a workshop, I think the materials are really what's going to be the most helpful for you to share with colleagues. So please get set up, and I'd say just 2 more minutes, and then we will get started. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy days to join us this morning. I really appreciate it, and we will get started in just a moment. If anybody has any audio problems, you can put it into the chat. I'm not sure I can help you very much. In theory, you should be able to see my video cam and hear me right now. If that's not the case, you can always restart GoToWebinar and check your audio settings. There's a limit to what we can do on our end. And yeah, just a couple more minutes, and then we'll get started. I still see some folks connecting to the system. So let's just give everybody 2 minutes. Grab yourself a coffee, glass of water. I think I'll grab myself a glass of water, and then we'll get started in just 2 minutes. Thanks so much. All right, fantastic. So we have more and more folks joining us from all over the world, really fantastic companies. We have people, I think, from almost every single industry. We've got folks, automotive, heavy industry, oil and gas, mining, as well as office environments, office buildings. So really fantastic to see so many people that are concerned with improving the compliance programs that you have at your organization. So just for those of you who are just joining us, please take a look at the handouts on the right-hand side. There's a tab with handouts. A couple of them have already been sent to you by email, but if you didn't grab the email ones, you can grab them here. We're going to have a number of polls throughout the workshop just to get feedback from you, to understand who's on the call, your own context. And then throughout the workshop, as opposed to me kind of inventing all sorts of situations and criteria for imaginary businesses, I think it would be most helpful if we had some volunteers who could fill out, and you can remain anonymous if you don't want to name your company or organization, that's totally fine. Compliance, of course, can be a sensitive subject. But any volunteers who can fill out the workshop material with me, I think that will be super helpful. And just make the session more interactive and more real. Everybody is living a different compliance situation at different organizations, and so getting your take on it would be extremely helpful. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen now, and we will get started. And we put 2 hours in for this workshop. We'll see how it goes. It might end a little bit earlier, but I will stay here as long as necessary to answer everybody's questions. So let me make my my webcam a little bit smaller here, or I will try to at least. Up, there we go. And then, okay, great. So now, let me just start by introducing myself, and I'm going to be jumping around a little bit because this workshop is really the combination of a whole bunch of different webinars and material that we have been working on over the last few years. So I'm going to be pulling information and ideas and topics from different webinars, and hopefully it gives you a comprehensive overview of what compliance looks like today in 2020. But all of this material that I'm showing you is publicly available on our website, and a lot of it is already in the handouts. So there's nothing top secret here. And the goal today is to help you just think through your compliance programs, identify some gaps, some issues, some things that maybe you could work on. Now, a brief introduction about myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jonathan Brudd. That's a photo of me, but I guess you can see me on the webcam as well. I am the founder, CEO of Nimonik. I am an engineer by trade, so take that for what you will. It certainly influences the way I think. I studied metallurgical engineering many years ago. It goes really quickly. But I've been working at Nimonik, running Nimonik for about 11 years now, and that also went really quickly, helping businesses all over the world improve their compliance programs, identify regulatory requirements, and just improve their general operations. And I'm really passionate about world-class compliance, as well as easy-to-use tools, whether it be Nimonik's tools or somebody else's tools. You know, what's important to me is that your organization stays in compliance with its own requirements, with regulatory requirements, and that you keep your workers safe, your products safe, and that the environment has minimal damage. So again, like I said, we're going to be jumping around a little bit. Please don't hesitate to put comments into the chat window if you want clarity. There's also a questions tab, and I do believe there's a way for you to raise your hand. And I'm going to do my best to manage all of this. But like I said, we do have about 500 registrants today, so it's going to be a little bit tricky to get to everybody. We'll do our best. Now, I already see some questions coming in. Okay, great. So that's a little bit about myself. A little bit about Nimonik. For those of you who don't know us, we are a software and regulatory compliance product. We offer this platform to customers all over the world to help them identify their regulatory requirements and then load in their own internal corporate or stakeholder or customer requirements, and then have a comprehensive overview of your compliance needs. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the product today. This is not a sales pitch. What I'm here today to do is to really help you think through your own compliance programs, give you some tools and some information that you can take back and implement on your end. So I'm just going to jump back to our comprehensive compliance workshop agenda. Now, the workshop that I'm going to try and do this morning with you typically takes at least a day, sometimes 2 days. It can be, you know, depending on the size of your organization, the level of maturity of your compliance programs, it can take a lot of time. So we're trying to do what we normally do in 1 to 2 days in under 2 hours. And as you can imagine, we're going to have to cut some corners. So I'm not going to go through all the elements of the workbooks that I provided to you, but I do want to kind of cover the main issues, the main topics, And then, of course, if you are interested in a personalized one-on-one workshop with one of our experts, we can certainly arrange that. But today is sort of meant to be a starting point for you. So what we normally cover in a one-day workshop is an overview of the different types of regulations, requirements, and this is called micro, macro, and then means and ends-based requirements. So I'm going to very briefly run through that. We did a webinar, an hour and a half webinar on that topic in 2019, and that's available on our website. So if you're interested in that, definitely take a look. I'm going to try and cover sort of the high-level information there in 10 minutes, just so we have a bit of a base. We then typically will move on to the 7 steps of compliance that Nimonik implements with its customers, where we try and identify the sources of the requirements that you have, the actions you need to take, subject matter experts, and then document how you as an organization plan to document your actions and manage change when it comes to changing of compliance requirements. And then talk a little bit about audit scheduling. How do you do corrective actions and assure that your actions are effective? So again, this is what we normally cover in 1 to 2 days. We're going to try and whip through it in about an hour and a half. Now, let me start with the why. One thing that I think is really important whenever you're trying to affect a change in an organization, whether it be compliance or something else, is to explain to everybody the why. Like, why are we doing this? Compliance is already not the most seductive, not the most exciting topic for a lot of people. So I think it's absolutely critical that as compliance professionals, that you engage with your colleagues, your staff, and explain to them the importance of compliance and how this will make a meaningful impact in your business, both from a financial point of view, as well as from a management and safety and product quality point of view. So the why to us is super important. And there's different ways to explain the why. But the way we kind of summarize it is that in 2020, in the 21st century, modern organizations should be able to operate efficiently and satisfy their customers without violations, spills, product recalls, or worker injuries. The analogy that I like to make with a lot of our colleagues is that compliance today is very much like quality, the quality crisis of the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, where, and I won't go into a lot of detail here, but when the Japanese car manufacturers came into North America with much higher quality cars at much lower cost, it really shook up the North American manufacturing sector. And it took a while for people to understand that when you addressed quality at the root, you avoided product recalls and rework of products, you actually created a much more financially healthy business. And I believe that with the growing amount of regulations, standards, reporting requirements, stakeholder engagements that all companies are facing all around the world, solving compliance at the root is going to become a competitive advantage for businesses all around the world. So we really think that modern organizations can operate efficiently and satisfy their customers without violations, spills, worker recalls, product recalls, or worker injuries. And the way we do this is a methodology that we've worked on and built over the last few years. We call it comprehensive compliance. So when we're talking about comprehensive compliance, what do we really mean? We mean that the goal that we should have, that you should have as an organization, is to capture all of your obligations across all of your issues. So that's environmental, product stewardship, HR, finance, etc. And then capture all the potential sources of your obligations. So this can come from government with regulatory agencies, it can come from standards, it can come from corporate, it can come from customers, it can come from investors. So you likely have thousands and thousands of obligations. And I'm not saying that to scare you, it is the truth for most medium to large businesses. And getting this under control and managing this, if you do it successfully, I'm convinced is a competitive advantage. Now, compliance and EHS and quality and all these other things can get very complicated, and they are very complicated. And you have all sorts of models, risk assessment models, prioritization models, all sorts of really fancy stuff that's available out on the web. I can happily give you some really detailed, information and very complex stuff. But I'm a big believer in the KISS principle. So it's, keep it simple, stupid. When you make something too complicated, it just becomes unmanageable. And maybe that's the ultimate goal, is to have a very complex risk assessment model, that cascades down your organization and gets everybody involved and really prioritizes things. And that perhaps is the long-term goal. But I think 90% of organizations have still not mastered the basics. And to me, the basics is, one, what are your obligations? What do you need to do to stay in compliance? Just getting that master list, and we're going to work on that today, is most organizations don't have that. Second, what are the actions we as an organization need to take and that different people and departments need to take to ensure we're meeting those obligations? And then three, how do we determine that we are meeting our obligations? Doing audits to determine, are the actions we've identified being taken? And if so, are they effective? Are they achieving the goal that we set out? So 3 things. Of course, this sounds easy. We all know it's super hard to implement in reality. But if we boil down compliance to these, to the distillate, I would say it really boils down to these 3 things. And until you've mastered this, a lot of the other stuff, all the fancy models and the matrices and things like that, my feeling personally, and I'm sure there'll be some folks who will disagree with me, my feeling is that's not necessary. That it's like, get the basics done first, and then you can look at more complex models. But we get caught up so much in trends and models and consulting services that propose some fancy solution. Keep it simple, stupid. That's my philosophy. So the 7 steps we're going to cover today. And let me make my screen a little bit bigger here. I'm going to just present this one slide, so it should pop up and be a little bit bigger. And I'm going to close this. So the 7 steps that we have today is, 1, identify your applicable regulations, standards, corporate documents. Select the ones that apply to you. What are the actions that you need to take to come into compliance? How do you plan to document those actions as you do them going forward? And then how do you plan to monitor for changes to your obligations? So that's your do part of your plan, do, check, act. And then audits, how are you going to do your audits to verify that your actions are taken and that they're effective? And then what are the follow-up actions and how do you deal with them when there are non-compliances that are detected? So that's our 7-step plan. And this is the way that the workbooks are structured. So if you have had a chance to look at the workbooks, and actually I have a poll about that, this is basically the foundation of what we're going to be talking about today. Let me close this window. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to launch a poll. And the first poll we have is, have you had time to read the workbook material that we sent out? So this workbook material you should have received by email when you registered for the webinar. Hopefully that worked for everybody. And it's also available in the handouts on the right-hand side. So I just want to get a sense of, have people had a time to look at the material, do your homework to a certain extent before the workshop today. It'll give me a sense of, how much I can take for granted. All right, so there's still a few responses coming in. We'll just wait for it to go a little bit higher, and then I'll close this poll. All right, so we've got the majority of people voting here. Okay, so I'm gonna have to go a little bit slower because we have right now 53% of people said they have not looked at the material yet. I know we're all super busy, so I totally understand. And 20% have said yes, so thank you to those 20% for doing the prep work. And then 28% have said somewhat. There is a fair amount of material, so I totally understand if you weren't able to read through everything. So that's the status that we're starting with today, and I just wanted to take that into consideration. So let me close that. I have one more poll before we kind of dive into this a little bit, and this is for the folks who said they did read the material or that they read it somewhat. So if you read it, just to get a quick feedback, did you find the material helpful, well organized? Does it stimulate some thoughts on your end? And I won't take it personally if you don't find the material to be fantastic. So feel free. But for those of you who are saying no, that the material wasn't necessarily as helpful as perhaps you would have liked, I am totally open to feedback. So please feel free to send something in the chat window or send me an email later, and I would be thrilled to get your feedback. We're always improving this workbook. It's an evolving document that is far from perfect. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me with feedback. Let me just close this poll and share it. So happily, 65, 64% of folks say the material is helpful, 31% say somewhat, and then 5% say no. So again, always want to hear from those folks who are saying no or somewhat. If you have any feedback, please, excuse me, send it my way. All right, great. So those are our first two polls. Let me just, I see some questions. Let me just see if, so Lily, you're saying, can you resend the material to us? In that, there's a handouts tab in the GoToMeeting system. There should be a drop-down called handouts, and where it says 5 out of 5. And in there, you will have the Excel file as well as the PDF version. So that's for the material. All right, great. Now, I want to start, before we dive into the workshop, the workbook material itself, I want to talk about two things. Or three things actually. So first, just a refresher, I think everybody on the call probably is familiar with this famous Swiss cheese model. Every time I see it, it makes me a little bit hungry for some cheese. But we all know that there's different levels in your organization, and then you have different systems in place, and the accident trajectory happens when something happens, and it goes through all these different levels of control. Now, I'm a big believer that if you get compliance right, you can pretty much close almost all the holes in one of these levels. Now, of course, you're still going to have workers who are going to do things that nobody predicted and that have not been identified in your obligations, but I think you can close the vast majority of the holes in one of these levels. And the book that I really recommend and that I had the entire team at Nimonik read is called Run to Failure. I've put a link in the chat of GoToMeeting. It's a book about British Petroleum, BP, and I don't know if there's any BP folks on the call or former BP folks. So if there is, I apologize for picking on you guys a little bit. But that book, which charts BP from the 1980s up until the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe, is, in my mind, a very, very good illustration of how non-compliance will eventually lead to huge problems. It's a bit of a ticking time bomb. So this Swiss cheese model, I'm a big believer that if you have compliance mastered, you will close off or almost close off entirely one of these levels. You'll never get to zero, but you'll get pretty close. Now, I wanted to discuss I wanted to mention one thing, that a lot of the work that we're doing today is based on ISO 19600. We did a webinar on this, I guess 3 months ago, 2 months ago. So if you're interested in more information on ISO 19600, which is a compliance management standard, I guess is the right word. It's not a, it doesn't have specific requirements in it. Sorry, it's a compliance management guideline, not standard, because it does not have particular requirements in it. I definitely suggest you take a look at the overall standard. We did a webinar on this before the holidays, and in the workbook material, you'll notice that we've included guidance notes from the standard for certain elements. Now, we haven't included the whole standard, and it's critical that you read the whole standard if you want to. I keep saying standard, but it's a guideline, the whole guideline, if you want to deal with it. So you have to buy a copy from ISO or from your local standards provider. But the webinar is available on our website, and a lot of what we're doing today is based on this, which is really quite a good guideline. And I'll come back to this French worker, which is a funny story when we talk about scope. Okay, let me take just a small breather for myself, and I'm going to have a drink of water here. So just to give you a sense of where we're at in the agenda. So we've done a little bit of welcome and kickoff. Hopefully gave you a bit of a background on Nimonik, myself, the workshop today. Hopefully everybody has the material. We're going to be going through the Excel version of the materials. So if you want to open that up on your end, you can fill it out for your organization. And then in just a moment, we'll talk briefly about micro, macro, means, and ends requirements, just to give a bit of context to that. And then we'll get into the rest of it. And again, if you have questions, please drop them into the chat window. I see a couple people have their hands raised. I think just for the sake of keeping this running smoothly, the best for now would be perhaps just to type something into the question window, so that I know exactly what you're looking for, whether it's a question or something else. It'll just be a little bit easier to answer than to unmute you and stop the webinar. Okay. So I just want to briefly talk about the 4 types of requirements that we see out in the wild. And I think this is really important because it helps understand that not all requirements are the same. Not all requirements are extremely specific about do this under this situation, do this. It would be nice because then it'd just be like a laundry list of things to do. But we all know that it's not that simple. So let me just make this a little bit bigger. This is a webinar that we did, I think, last summer, and I really enjoyed doing this webinar. It is available on our website, and the PDF, I believe I put in the handouts. If not, it's available on the website under the resources section in the webinar section. And I'm not going to, this webinar that we did in the summer took about an hour and a half, and I'm not going to run through the whole thing now. But I want to just give you a high-level overview of the different types of obligations that exist out there. So there are micro means, micro ends, macro ends, macro means. Now, what does this mean? That's a lot of M's. So a micro mean would be a requirement that I would say, normally we would think of this as a requirement where it's like very specific. It's, all workers on a construction site must be wearing their PPE at all times. So it's a very specific requirement for a specific situation that's relatively easy to follow. I mean, there's not a lot of room for interpretation. It's fairly straightforward. So that's sort of the traditional way we viewed requirements. Now there are, but the regulatory and the standards-based world has evolved a lot. And we're starting to see more things. We've seen already a lot of things that are micro ends, and that's where they're giving a clear objective. So it's micro, but it's an objective. It's an end. It's not a means. So here you could think of like air emissions restrictions, or you could think of contaminants that you're allowed to emit into. So if you emit over 10,000 tons of greenhouse gases, you need to do this, this, and this. So it is micro ends driven. It's all about what's the ultimate objective, and the ultimate objective is to get your greenhouse gases lower. Then you have macro means. So we've covered micro means, which is very specific, very micro. Micro ends, which is an end, it's an objective, but it's specifying like very specific objectives. Say get the sulfur dioxide below a certain level. Macro means is your management systems. So those are like big overall structures where they're saying you need to have a safety management system in place, or you need to have a risk management system in place. And this can come from corporate, it can come from the government, it can come from different places. And so those are not really the same thing. I mean, those are a lot harder to implement because saying you need a safety management system actually requires you to do a whole bunch of other stuff. Those are macro means. And then you have macro ends. Now, macro ends can be a variety of things, but think of them as like potentially industry-wide targets. So like electric vehicle quotas for the automotive industry, general air emissions quotas for a specific industry or a specific jurisdiction. So macro ends, they're macro, they're big, and then they're ends objectives. So maybe the objective is to have, a reduction in single-use plastic. Like, for example, a number of countries, including Canada, are now pushing to get single-use plastic out of the economy. And so that's a macro ends type requirement that's going to affect a lot of businesses. And so those are 4 different types of obligations that your organization is likely subject to. And of course, you can't deal with all 4 in exactly the same way, but what we want to do today is critical that you identify the types of obligations you have, and then the types of obligations you have. So if you'd like to learn more about this differentiation between micro and macro and ends and means, take a look at our webinar. It's online, as well as we've linked to, on the webinar, we linked to a number of other documents that might be of interest for you. Okay, great. So I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview on that. Let me stop here and see if does anybody have any questions about this these 4 types of obligations, these 4 types of requirements that we're seeing out in the real world. If you have a question about this before we move on, please post your question to the questions tab, and I'll try and address it as best I can. We'll just give a couple minutes or a couple seconds for folks to do that. Someone's saying they agree with us Canada getting rid of single-use plastics. Okay, so let me pop out the questions tab here. So courses, someone's Risk is asking about the course. So the course that we offer, the 1 to 2 day one, typically we do it one-on-one with an individual company, and then periodically we organize a group one. Okay, great. So if there's no questions about macro, micro, and means and ends, we'll move on and start diving into the actual workbook. So I'm going to open up the workbook here, which is in a spreadsheet format. You should have received it in Excel. There's also a PDF format, so if you're filling it out by hand with a pen and paper, the PDF might be a little bit more user-friendly. But the overall goal of the workbook is the same. I'll show you. This is the PDF version. And just as an introduction, regulations, what I try to explain to folks, especially people who aren't in the compliance space, is that regulations and standards exist to incite behavior that would not normally occur, right? I mean, if people normally did the stuff that is currently regulated or put into standards, then we wouldn't need the regulations or standards, right? So the whole point of all of this work that different agencies and standards bodies are doing is to affect change, right? To get people and organizations to change. And as we say, compliance might not always be the most fun thing in the world, but we believe it's critical to the foundation of a well-run organization. So we've already discussed the 7 steps of the compliance program, and now we're going to dive into a little bit the details. But I'm going to do it in the Excel version. I think it'll be a little bit easier. So, I think the first step is to get a good understanding of your own organization or the organization you're working with, if you're a consultant or an external party. And so getting that high-level overview to us is critical, and it helps you just understand what you're up against, perhaps. So the first tab on the Excel spreadsheet and on the PDF is just general information. We're not yet diving into like specific requirements. We're just trying to gather information about the organization. Now, let's see. Do we have a volunteer? I can unmute you. And you'll just need to have your microphone working, and I'd be thrilled to have somebody volunteer to help fill out a little bit this first page with me, and I'll be there to help you. But it'd be great if we had a volunteer. So let me see. If you want to volunteer, I think the best way to do it would be to just put something in the chat window or in the questions tab, and then I will unmute you. Let me know, do we have a volunteer? Don't be shy, it won't hurt. And if we don't have a volunteer, I'll try and do it myself, but it'd be great if we had somebody who is willing to step up and just explain a little bit the context of your organization. And again, you can remain anonymous if you don't want to name your organization. That's totally fine. Let's see, do we have, I see some raised hands, but let me see if we have anybody want to volunteer to run through a little bit your current organization and your current compliance status? I will be very grateful if you have. So Stephanie has raised her hand. Stephanie Eckert. can I take that as a volunteering? Is that okay, Stephanie? Let me see if I can. Can I unmute you, Stephanie? I'm going to unmute you, Stephanie. Stephanie, so was your raised hand a volunteer? Stephanie, can we hear you? Can you hear us? I can hear you tapping on the keyboard, but I'm not sure if you want to volunteer. Okay. Well, I'm not sure if Stephanie is volunteering or not. I've unmuted you. So, Stephanie, would you like to volunteer to run through the first page? No? Okay. Let me just mute you again then. So if we don't have a volunteer, unfortunately, I'll try and do this the best I can myself. And perhaps I'll volunteer for the next steps. So organization name, headquarters, location, description of operations. I think this is all fairly standard stuff that hopefully everybody knows about their own organization. Getting a number of how many sites are you operating, how many jurisdictions do you operate in. So when we talk about jurisdictions, we're talking about federal, perhaps supranational, national. Like if you're in the EU, you got to be paying attention to EU regulations, national regulations, and then potentially regional or province or city level regulations. So I think often we kind of don't look at the city level, or we don't look at some of the lower level regulations, and that's where we can get tripped up, and you don't get the right permit, the city inspector slows down a project, etc. So identifying how many organizations you operate in, and then eventually which how many jurisdictions you operate in, and then which jurisdictions apply to which sites. Assessing your compliance team headcount. I think this is important because we can all set ourselves really lofty objectives for compliance, but if you don't have the resources internally, those objectives are not attainable. So it's critical that you first do an assessment of, do we have the resources to actually execute on our compliance program. Describe the organizational culture. So organizational structure, this one. So you want to understand who reports to who, and is compliance taken seriously at the upper levels of the organization, and that's usually determined through the reporting structure. Identify main organizational components with compliance roles. So often compliance will be divided amongst different departments, different people, and so you want to identify who has a foot or a hand in your compliance efforts. And then fines or penalties received. I said 5 years. It's an arbitrary number. You could say 10 years, but you want to do a bit of an assessment of, hey, what is our actual track record when it comes to compliance? Have we received fines? Have we received penalties? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? It will be a good tool for you to make a business case to management, as well as it's a bit of a, of course, a fine is a symptom. It's not the cause of your problem, it's a symptom. But if you're getting fines regularly, you probably have a compliance problem. And then how big is your organization? So what's the total market cap of the organization, if you know that information as a publicly traded company? And then how big is the company itself? How many people are going to eventually need to get involved in compliance? What management systems do you have in place? And then any certifications that you might have in terms of ISO standards or other standards. So that's sort of just high-level information on the organization. I do think it's important that you do this in a thorough way so that you understand your organization as best you can, and put it onto paper, and it will influence the rest of the workbook. Now, let me launch another poll here. I'm going to say, I want to know, do you have a global compliance program? So a lot of organizations still have very siloed compliance programs, and I'm curious to know, do you have a global program where you have like one compliance program that covers everything? Or do you have a combination of global and siloed? So you maybe have one that like sits on top, but then you have dedicated compliance programs for environment and safety and quality and HR? Or do you have just silos where it's like just everybody's on their own, it's decentralized, there's no real overarching compliance program? So I'm just gonna wait for the responses to come in here. If you can just click on the poll, it'll just help us have a bit of context as to who's on the call and what your situations are. All right, so the votes are coming in. Let's give it another 5 seconds or so. And I'm going to close the poll now just so we keep moving along and share the results. We got about half, 53% are global and siloed. So you have some sort of overarching system and then siloed. 11% are global only. So that's interesting. And then 20% or 19% are siloed only, which I'd say perhaps on, we have a biased sample on this call because it's folks who are already somewhere along on their compliance journey. Less mature organizations often have siloed only, but we do see 16% of folks here have little to no programs. So that's a bit worrying. We're here to help you. So you had about 16% on the call today, and I'm really thrilled that that's 16% that you're taking the initiative to come to a workshop like this. So that's our results there. And as we're still in the assessment phase, I want to ask everybody if they have any certifications. I've only picked a few certifications, so ISO 9001, 14001, 45,001, and alternatively you could say 18,001 if you're still on the old one, and then 52,000, the energy one, and others. I'm sure there's a whole whackload of certifications for different issues, of course. So just get a sense of the people on the call again, and what you're dealing with, because certifications will often drive a lot of your efforts because you have to maintain that certification. Okay, let me just give another few seconds and we'll close this poll and keep moving along. All right, great. So I just want to hit that 50% participation rate. All right, great. We're now well up above 50%. So let me share this result. So we got 50% have an ISO 14001 certification. 28% have 45,001. That's pretty impressive. And then quite a few have 9,001, and then 51% have other, and of course other is quite varied. Fantastic. All right, those are our two polls for the moment. Let's go back to the workbook. All right. Now again, if there's a volunteer who wants to jump in, I would be most grateful. If not, I will keep going just on my own and hopefully be of help to you. So describe the culture. So the second kind of part of the assessment is to understand your overall context of the organization and the society, the environment that you operate in. I think this is really important because it's very hard to affect a change, to make a change in an organization if the culture of the organization or the culture of the society goes against it. I mean, you're just fighting such an uphill battle. And so it's critical to understand what's the environment you're operating in. And so I won't go through every single item here because I do want to get through all 7 steps today, even if we don't go into a lot of detail. But I tried to, with this workbook, I tried to say, let's start at the top, the overall culture of your society. So the example I gave here was, we all, when we think of Japan, I don't know if there's anybody, it's not a very good time for a webinar in Japan right now. So there's not too many, Japanese companies on the call today. But we all, when we think of Japan, I think we think of very disciplined. They take compliance very seriously, and it's well embedded in the average person's behavior. So therefore, getting somebody to actually respect a set of rules tends to be easier. Whereas you go to some other countries, and I won't name them, but you go to some other countries that maybe have a bit more of a free spirit. It can sometimes be harder to get people to do specific actions you want them to. And then, the second step here is government. So how does the government culture with regards to compliance impact you? And do they come and do lots of inspections and fines? EPA and OSHA, for those of you in the US, obviously you know that they're pretty serious. I mean, EPA and OSHA tends to be quite serious about their job and about the regulations. I'm in Canada. We work with a lot of Canadian companies, and I like Canada very much, but I can assure you that the Canadian regulatory agencies are much less strict than the EPA or OSHA. They come, they don't necessarily give you fines right away. They give you warnings. They say, hey, you can do it. We can work together. Maybe it's that polite Canadian side. So the culture of the government, the way the government interacts with organizations has a big impact. And then, so we've gone from society down to government. Now, if we look at your specific organization, what's the culture when it comes to compliance? Do people take compliance seriously? Does upper management take compliance seriously? I think there's another point for that. This is obviously very important. We talk a lot about safety culture when it comes to health and safety, and that's important. I don't want to, reduce the importance of safety culture, But to me, compliance culture is critical. If you have compliance culture, you can usually get safety culture to happen fairly easily. But if you have safety culture, you can't necessarily get compliance culture. So you want to get people to understand, why is compliance important? I mean, the why is so important. And then to try and embed that culture. And that requires repetition. There's some statistics that to get people to change their habits, you need to do something 62 times. I'm not sure exactly which study that came out of, but 62 times is a lot. So repeat, 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 explain why compliance is important. Does your company have a compliance policy? What are the general lines of that policy? What is management's perception of compliance? And then an assessment here you would put into this workbook, does your management support or hinder compliance? And there you can think of some examples where, management says one thing, they say you got to comply to this, but then on the side they go and do something else that's not in compliance. And so at Nimonik, I always tell everybody at Nimonik that, like, if I'm doing something that doesn't respect procedure or that doesn't respect the rules that we've set, they need to hold me accountable, because none of us will remember all the things we need to do or everything that we have to comply with. That's just not likely to happen. So it's important that your coworkers and your subordinates and your superiors hold you accountable. And so that's the culture that we try to build at Nimonik, and we encourage other companies to have. But management at the end of the day is the leadership, and so you want to determine, are they helping or hindering compliance efforts? And I put a comment here, a sample. They're supportive, but have not been willing to allocate resources. And so that comes back to the headcount and the resources comment earlier. So that's your current context assessment. And then I wanted to go on to interested parties. So interested parties assessment, which is the second part. And so here we get into a little bit more detail, like, do your employees and contractors understand their responsibility to meet compliance obligations? Can employees and contractors easily report a non-compliance? So a bit like a whistleblower thing. You want to make sure that, again, that people hold each other accountable. If they can't easily report it, or if they're like, whatever, it's just Jim, that's the way he does it, or Jim's been here for 25 years, he knows better, then it's going to be very hard to get compliance embedded deeply into your organization. So you need people to feel comfortable that they can report and make it super easy. Also, if people have like a 2-page form that they need to fill out for an incident or for a non-compliance, how likely are they to fill out that form? I mean, they're only going to fill it out when there's a real issue. So you want to make it super easy. It can be an anonymous email box. It can be posters in the office. It could be a physical box that people can drop stuff into. And often you do want to have a side of anonymity to it. Depends exactly what you're trying to capture. So when there are new requirements, new compliance obligations that are issued by your organization, by the government, by standards agencies, how do you communicate that? How do you cascade that down to your organization? And this is an assessment. So for this part, you want to determine not what you would like to do, but what are you doing now, right? And that will give you a bit of a benchmark. And I have a hand up, so let me see if let me go to the hands. Let me see if I can find this hand. But again, this is all about assessment, and I think the hand disappeared. So if you have a question, let me know. So okay, so I get. Let me see. Hold on. General tab on Excel spreadsheet is blank. Is it supposed to be a protected sheet? No, the general tab should not be blank. So if you have an issue, try and download it from the handouts again. Right now, Don, you're the only person that's saying that it's blank. So let me know, but no, the general tab should be okay. So. And then a good question from Rick saying, many organizations have ethics and compliance programs. Do you see this as being part or standalone? I definitely think ethics and compliance programs can be tied into an overall compliance program. Ethics, at the end of the day, is often a set of rules, things you're allowed to do, not allowed to do. And so I think you can build off of that and grow it. And I think the ultimate goal, right now, a lot of folks still have these blend of global and siloed compliance operations. I do believe that in the long term, we will see kind of a master compliance program and risk management program in organizations. Right now, it's evolved in an organic way where we had stuff for environment, we had stuff for safety, we had stuff for ethics. Then some incident happens, whether it's Deepwater Horizon or whether it's financial fraud issue, the financial crisis of 2008, and so then the governments react, standards bodies react. So because it's sort of a reactive process as organizations and the economy matures, you see it bubbling up from the bottom. But I think eventually you're going to see organizations will have like a comprehensive compliance program that captures all of their requirements. Continuing on this assessment, and I'm going to try and go a little bit faster so we can get through the workbook and leave time for questions. So you want to see who's the most senior compliance official at the company. If they don't have somebody high up that's reporting to the CEO, then in all likelihood you have an issue. What authority does this person have? Can they shut down operations? Can they let people go? Can they affect real change? So it's not just about where they sit, but it's also about what powers they have, and do they have sufficient resources? So that comes back a little bit to the head count. You might have a very beautiful compliance program that was written up and it sits in a binder in a fancy software somewhere, but if you don't have people to execute on it, it's very, very challenging. And so we were, one customer that we worked with, a fairly large company, and I won't name them, we built a great program for them. We developed it, we implemented it, but they just didn't want to allocate the sufficient resources internally to really process the information and to deal with it. And so there was a regulation that came up in a jurisdiction they operate in that they didn't catch, because their program caught it, their systems, it was in the systems, there was an alert sent, but there wasn't a human, there wasn't a person, there weren't enough people to deal with these changes coming from the governments and then to take action. So you got to determine, do we have the resources to do this? And you have to be honest about that. You don't want to be too optimistic. So if there's a lack of resources, determine what the immediate next steps are. Normally you would pare down your program, communicate the issue to management, try and get more budget. And I think there's a lot of opportunity now to make the business case for compliance. I mean, there's so many things in the news about compliance. We can think of Boeing, which is obviously in the news all the time. We can think about Volkswagen a few years ago with the Dieselgate. So the cost of non-compliance, and we have that whole presentation, which is available on our website, called Not So Hidden Cost of Compliance right here, which is a big photo of Deepwater Horizon. Cost is going up every day. So do compliance officials have independence from operations? So, are they independent agents? They're not going to be, their promotion should not be dependent on the number of compliance issues they raise, right? And then, is your compliance policy easily available to all staff, and do staff know it? So it's one thing to have a policy, it's another thing for staff to know it. All right, so that's a little bit like the assessment phase that I encourage everybody to go through. And it will just, allow you to take a step back, understand your organization, your society, the governments, and like, what's the system you're working within. So in terms of policy improvements that we recommend, the first is to map out who your interested parties are, whether this be internal people, customers, contractors, investors. So who are the interested parties? More and more we're seeing, pressure from investors on sustainability issues, and that has a compliance element to it. So who's the interested parties? What are their needs? And then here we start to get into like projecting, what is the desired general company culture with regards to compliance? So earlier on, we talked about like, what is the current culture? What's the environment we're working in? Here, you would want to write, what is the desired general company culture? So it might be something along the lines of, all staff and contractors understand the importance of compliance, they understand the policies, and they endeavor every day to stay in compliance while doing their jobs. So that might be the ultimate goal that you want to get to, where 100% of people are on board, and you want to write that out in here. And then here, I think this is critical. Describe any roadblocks to changing management and company culture. So we say our goal is up here, and we're down here. What are the roadblocks that are going to prevent us from getting there? And there's going to be roadblocks. I promise you that much. It could be people, it could be systems, it could be budgets. So you got to identify what are the roadblocks that we need to overcome to get to our ultimate goal. And then you can start, hopefully dismantling some of those roadblocks. And in some organizations, the roadblocks will be insurmountable. I mean, that's just the honest truth. The company culture is so deeply embedded. The people, until you change the people, it's not going to change. And we saw this. There's a port in Quebec. Again, I won't name the specific port, who had tons of compliance problems. They had lawsuits coming at them from the community, lawsuits coming at them from the city, and they just stonewalled everything. They didn't want to deal with it. And what happened eventually is that the administration, the board, and the administration of the port changed. And the new board came in and they said, okay, we're going to have a whole culture shift. So the board itself and the leadership at that port was a roadblock. And eventually that was solved, but you need to identify those roadblocks. All right, so that's policy improvements, scope and authority. So you want to outline. Again, this is projecting. So describe the scope of the compliance policy you would like to implement in this workbook. So here, we're not talking about the scope of the policies you have, but rather the scope that you want to have. And then what's the desired knowledge of the compliance policy by employees and other parties? Is there evidence of rewards and punishment for compliance issues at your organization? So this comes back to a little bit, having a feedback loop as well as communicating the importance of compliance. So when people do a really great job and they stay in compliance and they operate without any problems, we should be thanking them. I mean, often we forget that, but operating a business or organization successfully with no problems, that is an achievement. That's a huge achievement. And often we don't celebrate that, but we should. And we celebrate these things that kind of go out of the ordinary. But celebrating good compliant operations is something you should be doing on a regular basis, and that will reinforce the importance of compliance. So you want to describe a little bit, what's the evidence you want to give, or what's the systems you want to put in place to reward, and as well, the truth is you do need to punish. If people can do non-compliances at your organization and not have any consequences, then of course it's going to continue. So that can be in performance reviews, it can be in other methods, more drastic if necessary. So risk assessment, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to go through steps 1 to 7. The risk assessment here we'll come back to, but risk assessment is tied to steps 2, 5, and 6 of the plan. So I don't want to talk about that right now. And then I think the last point last couple points on the first tab is training. So you want to determine our staff trained appropriately on compliance and what kind of training resources you could give them going forward. And then reporting. So how do you share reports? And again, this will be post step 6. So once you've done your audits and you've done your assessment, what's the reporting that you're doing? And then will there be an overall compliance plan in your organization that's based on evidence, based on reports, that's continuously updated? Will you put that in place? This is really kind of the concluding question on the assessment or the general information tab. It's what does your compliance program report look like in 2 to 3 years once you made these changes? Let me just pause for a second and see if we have any questions. So let me see. Have downloaded the handouts and tried opening several times. Okay, sorry about that, Dawn. I will send you the handouts personally. I'm not sure what's going on there. So we'll have a look at that and send that over to you. Great. Okay, let's get started on step 1. So let me just do a recap. If I go find this, let me make this a little bit bigger. So just a refresher, the 7-step plan that we are talking about is identifying your applicable regulations. That's step 1. Step 2 is to select the obligations that apply to you. Step 3 is to identify actions in a process with your subject matter experts to deal with your obligations. Step 4 is to document your compliance actions. Step 5 is to monitor for changes. So that's really important because things change. We all know that. And so you got to monitor for changes. Then step 6 is to do audits, assessments, determine whether or not you're in compliance. And then step 7 is to take follow-up action. So it's your plan, do, check, act framework that everybody is probably familiar with. Okay, great. So step 1, sources. I think this is hopefully fairly straightforward. You have a column here that's called obligations, and here I put in sources. So you're going to have obligations coming at you from lots of different places: government agencies, industry bodies, if you're certified to a management standard, if you are reporting into a sustainability, a fair trade, some sort of other system. So you have obligations and sources, and this is high-level sources. So it's like not specific documents, but more agencies, standards bodies, industry bodies, investors. So just the organization itself that is imposing an obligation on you. And then you can determine, is this a requirement? Like, does this agency have the ability to require me to do something? Or does this agency or organization simply have the ability to recommend that I do something, right? And then I can then choose to commit to. So you'll want to kind of differentiate between what's a hard requirement and what's a commitment. And then describe a little bit the culture of the source organization. Like, are they very aggressive? Are they going to be following up all the time? And do we need to take that into account? What part of your organization does this agency or organization have an impact on? So it might be, just your environmental department, or it might be your safety department or HR department. And then have you identified the documents that this agency has issued that you need to comply with? And then when did you last take a look at this agency, and who did that review of the agency? And you have a bit of guidance text here. So that's step 1. It's really just an inventory of the bodies that have the ability to issue requirements or commitments to you. And again, if we have a volunteer, please feel free to step in. Okay, here's a question from Rick. How do you even start to identify sources of obligations? Yeah, I think that's a good question. So there's some obvious ones, which is government. So we go back to the general information tab, where we're trying to identify the jurisdictions you operate in. I would say, start with government, because you definitely have obligations from government. So you got to inventory the parts of the government, the agencies, or different departments that you need to pay attention to. It's not simply enough to say, well, we have to comply with the U.S. federal code, which of course you do if you're in the U.S. But it's more about breaking it up, like the independent agencies, so OSHA, EPA, others, Department of Labor, things like that. So I would start with government. Then I would say you want to look at standards bodies, and standards bodies that if you've already received a certification, or if you have a management system that's based on a standard, look at the standards bodies. And then you got to do an inventory of your operations, like your products. So if you have products that have certifications, or if your investors are imposing certain things on you and you're filling out certain reports, you would list those, investors, or let's say you're doing some sustainability reporting that is optional, but you've chosen to do it. Those are the types of engagements here. So you got to kind of take a step back: governments, industry bodies, standards organizations, and look at your investors. If you're a publicly traded company, look at your investors that are this large ones. Look at any reports that you've already published. That can also be a good indicator. So that's there. But it can be, you probably won't capture everything the first time around, but you give it a shot. Insurance, that's a good one. Laura is mentioning, look at your insurance policies. Insurance definitely will have requirements in it, obligations, things, things like number of people in a location, fire suppression systems, etc. So look at your insurance policies. And that also is a fantastic way to identify some of your sources. All right, so once you've identified the sources of potential requirements or commitments, and this would also include things like stakeholder engagements. Like you're building a plant and you've got the local community to buy into something, and they say, yeah, well, we'll support you as long as you build a gymnasium for our community. Okay, well, that's going to be a requirement, and you got to make sure you follow up on that. So then you start getting into the actual individual requirements. So when you talk to, the first column here, I'm trying to link the step 1 to step 2. So sources, so it could be something like, EPA. I'll just take a very basic example. And then which part of your organization is going to be responsible? Maybe it's the environmental management department. What type of document is it? Is a requirement? You could include like those macro, micro, means and ends type distinctions that I discussed earlier. I haven't done it in the workbook, but you could definitely include that if you're motivated. And then here you'll want to put in like a unique requirement number. So now we're getting into like the details, right? But you can say like we're talking about like 40 CFR, part 10, etc. And that's just for those of you who are in the States, it's just a part of the US federal code that deals with environmental issues. So you want to get really specific, and then document name, here actually would go to a lower level. So it'd be like, clause 126, for example. I'm just inventing that, but you get the idea. It's like you want to give a very specific thing. And then document name in this case would be maybe like 40 CFR part 10. And another document we could say like, here we have like HR. So it could be like internal requirement, and it could be, your sexual harassment policy article 9, and then the document is just sexual harassment policy. And so that can be an internal document, it doesn't have to be an external document. And then a document identifier. So one challenge I've seen over the years is you list all these documents, but then the document names change, and you can't track it back. So if possible, you want to have some sort of like a clear identifier that allows you to just go back to the source document. Here you would break up like a clause that was identified. Sorry, my mistake. This should be in here. This is a specific clause you've identified. This unique requirement number is a number that you will invent. My apologies for the confusion. This is a number that you will invent that you can then use on the other tabs and in your system to say, okay, this is requirement 3 within your overall compliance program. You can put in the actual text of the requirement here, an explanation of what you got to do, applicability to the organization, like how does it apply to you? And then here's where you can start to do a risk analysis. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about risk analysis today, but of course, you're going to have such a long list of requirements and obligations that you got to prioritize. And risk assessment can be very helpful. I would say keep it simple. What's the impact and what's the frequency of the activity that is subject to this requirement? You keep it real simple and just try and prioritize your risk, and what is the fallout, financial or other of a non-compliance. And you have some ISO 19600 guidance here. So this tab is designed to help you just pick out specific requirements or commitments, obligations from your sources. And it can get very long. To give you a sense, just an EHS, a list of environmental health and safety requirements for a typical manufacturing site in a developed country is about 1,500 requirements. It gets really, really big fast. And that's just EHS. We're not even talking about HR. We're not talking about things. Now, you can start with something smaller, but I just want to give you a sense that this is a fair bit of work. Once it's done, you'll be in fantastic shape to stay in compliance. But that's where you identify requirements, and you can purchase tools to do a lot of this work for you, so you don't have to go and search through the individual documents. Nimonik offers a database of requirements pulled from 200,000 different regulatory documents. There's other services out there that offer requirements as well. So you don't have to do this all manually. You can buy some services. But you can't cheat. I mean, if you don't figure out what your requirements are, you're going to have a non-compliance, right? I mean, you got to go through this. So that's identifying requirements. That's step 2. Step 3 is identifying subject matter experts. So on step 2, we identified the responsible part of the organization that would be tackling this. And then on tab 3, what we recommend people do is to drill down into more detail. And so the step 2, sorry, here, like I could say, okay, environment department, I'm going to copy that over. I'm going to put that into here. Applies to which part of your organization? I'll say environment. And then who's the person or the team that needs to tackle this specific requirement? So I'm going to copy over the unique requirement here, which is requirement 1. I want to put that into tab number 3 here. So we're tracking requirement number 1, and then we're going to say who's responsible for this. And so we can say it's corporate environment team. And job title here is a little bit less relevant because it's a team, but let's just say it's like VP EHS ultimately. And competence assessment. So here you want to determine, do they have a competence to actually come into compliance? If you give somebody a task that they don't have the competence for, it's asking for trouble. So you can say yes, has competence, or you could do another one like no, requires training, and then where are they located? So it could be like HQ. Who do they report to? It could be CEO, and so you would want to go through this and basically identify who's responsible for what. It's the who, what, when, how. So if you can achieve that, man, you're in great shape. So that's subject matter experts, and this mapping is critical to know who's responsible for what. You can do it all in Excel. Of course, there's software out there like Nimonik or others that will help you manage this, send out alerts, notifications, reports, things like that. But I always recommend that you first do it in Excel before buying any sort of system, because you'll get a much deeper understanding of your organization and your program if you just do it in Excel first before trying to buy some fancy software. So that is the subject matter experts. Does anybody have any questions about what we've covered so far? Either step 1, 2, or 3. So sources, requirements, subject matter experts. Let me know if anybody has any questions. Please pop them into the questions tab, and I will bring up the questions tab now just to see if we got anything. So okay, nothing right now. We still have quite a few people on the call, which is fantastic. I really appreciate everybody taking the time this morning. All right, that was subject matter experts. Then we get into actions. So what I've tried to do in this workbook is to identify what is the trigger that's going to, cause an action to happen. So it might be, we got to do this every month. We need to submit a report to the government every month, or we need to do a training for all new staff. So you hire somebody, that's your trigger. You got to do a training on, sexual harassment policy. And so what's the trigger that's going to cause you to have an action? The unique requirement, so that's from your previous steps. So let's just say I'll take the example earlier, and I'm going to take requirement number 1, which was just an environmental one that we invented, put it into here. So 1, so we'll say the trigger here is a regulatory change. So the EPA decides to change something, it gets into that part of the US CFR, it affects this, and then it's like, how do we know that this change has happened? So in the case of a regulatory change, it might be a mailing list of regulatory agency. It might be a commercial product like Nimonik that you've purchased. It might be something else. What's the action that needs to be taken? So in this case, the change has to be reviewed and reassigned to an appropriate person. And then what's the expected notes that you want your staff to put in? You got to give them guidance on like how much detail do you want, because sometimes we've seen people that say, yeah, I did it, I did the action you asked me to do, but they don't necessarily explain a little bit more about what they did or any issues they face. So you want to make sure you give them guidance on what's the evidence and the notes that they should provide into the software, into the Excel spreadsheet, or by email, whatever, that allow you to then report higher up later on. They're like, yeah, Bob said he did it, and he said he did this, this, and this. Oh, Bob actually didn't do it. So then you have that paper trail. It's all about a paper trail. And then delay to respond. So set an expectation for how fast people should respond. And if there's any controls or SOPs, standard operating procedures, that need to be followed while you're doing this, you might want to list them here. So let's say there's a company, I'll take another example, company policy change. Let's say it's that sexual harassment one. I think we put it as item number 3. Oh, sorry. What's the action? Maybe it's like retraining of all staff, and then expected content that you want the staff is like, did they sign that they received sexual harassment training, and let's say you got to retrain all the staff within 2 months, and then a control might be maybe you have a training manual, maybe you have a way that your organization does training. So you outline the trigger, what's going to create the change, unique requirements, information source, actions, and expected notes, and delayed responding controls. I have a question here, so let me just pop that open. Do you have a list of regulatory sources and relevant clauses depending on the yes. Yeah, Mina, we do, for I think 400 jurisdictions around the world. So we can follow up afterwards. Hi, Jonathan. What is the usual type of professional most inclined to become compliance specialist? Internal auditor or H&S professional? That's a good question. I don't know. I don't really have any data on that. I guess my response would be somebody who cares about compliance. I mean, compliance is challenging, but it's also not, it's not rocket science. I think if you can get through these 7 steps and read ISO 19600 and dig a little bit deeper into some things, then you can be a compliance professional. I mean, I don't want to belittle any like training that people have received or anything like that, but I think that if you're motivated to keep your company in compliance and to set up a system, and you have some basic training and management systems, you can do it. Auditors can be good, but at the same time, an auditor often they're taking a snapshot of an organization or a situation, and they're issuing an audit report, and that is very helpful, and that's part of our plan. But a great compliance professional is somebody who goes and identifies the root causes, identifies a roadmap of how to improve the organization, and then implements it. That to me is like really the ideal situation. Similarly with like lawyers, in theory, lawyers care about keeping the organization compliant, but what we've seen over the years, and I don't know if there's any lawyers on the call, is that they're very problem centric, like reactive. There's a problem, they're buying a new plant, they're selling a plant, they're very good at dealing with those types of situations. But what you need to do as a compliance professional is to understand systems and how everything is connected. That's what I'm trying to do with these 7 steps, is like one thing is connected to another thing. You can't just do one thing, you got to kind of do it all together. So that's my long answer to your question. This will be a full-time job for anybody to ensure companies stay in compliance. For sure, it's definitely a full-time job. And that comes back to the resources tab, or the resources thing earlier on the first tab, is you got to determine, does your organization have the resources to do this? Because it's not a part-time job. And you need to build a business case, because a lot of times the management, they don't see this as an investment, they see this as a cost. And that's why I use that analogy to the quality crisis of the 80s, because back then also companies saw quality as being tied to cost. Like if I wanted to make a higher quality product, it needed to be a more expensive product. It needed to cost more to make. And what the Japanese did with lean manufacturing was to flip that on its head by saying, no, if you solve quality at the root, you save so much money going forward, and it actually is cheaper, less expensive to operate. And so you got to make that business case in your organization. But yeah, it's a full-time job. Okay, so that was step 4. We have 7 steps, so we're a little bit over halfway done, and then we'll have a bit of time for Q&A afterwards. I got one more question. Let me grab that before we dive into step 4. Compliance officers are almost always perceived as cost centers by Don. Yeah, totally agree, Don. I think they are almost always perceived as cost centers. And so that's where I think like education of upper management is so critical. And you got to do analogies. Like people understand better through analogy, or more easily through analogy, than they do through like a purely rational, objective kind of explanation. And so analogy of the quality crisis of the 80s, and that took a lot of businesses under, like they went bankrupt because they could not compete with the Asian manufacturers. And then the other thing is like highlight companies in your industry that have had compliance issues and that impacts their bottom line. So if you're in the automotive sector, talk about Volkswagen, talk about other companies that their production lines were shut down because they were out of compliance. We worked with one company in China. They had non-compliances related to worker safety and environmental, and the Chinese government shut down the whole production line for like a week. And in the automotive industry, as many of you know, it's a just-in-time manufacturing. So I can tell you that the people that were buying their parts were really upset because it shut down other assembly lines. So highlighting those examples, super important. You can go download our PowerPoint here, which has 10 compliance crises that led to big disasters. They're mostly environmental or health and safety in nature. You can certainly find sexual harassment cases, with CEOs getting fired. You can find financial fraud cases, but find something that's relevant to your organization, to your industry. That will probably be the most impactful to try and shift their mentality from a cost center. It has to be presented as return on investment to boards or executives, and service industries are the toughest to deal with. Yeah, Don, totally agree. Service industry where you have high turnover, you have different projects, each project is something very cost sensitive, like you're bidding and it's like, what's the lowest cost? That's often the hardest to affect compliance change for sure. Okay, great. So I just want to make sure we finish on time and cover everybody's questions. So we're on to step 5. Just a summary, we did an assessment. We identified the sources of compliance issues or compliance requirements and commitments. We identified specific, we gave you a framework to identify specific requirements. Of course, I didn't do the work for you. Who's going to be responsible for those requirements? What kind of actions do they got to take, and what kind of evidence do they have to leave? So that's step 1, 2, 3, 4. And now we're talking about monitoring for changes. So we alluded to that a little bit in the previous step, where if a regulation changes or if a policy changes, that could be a trigger for an action. But your actions can also just be periodic, audits. So monitor for changes. If we take step 1, government agencies. And so you're monitoring like your EPA, let's say you want to monitor that like weekly. Who's going to be responsible for this? It could be corporate environment team. What's the internal communication method? So if a change happens, how does that cascade throughout the organization? Is it through email, through a software that you purchased and implemented, through a meeting that happens? So let's just say it's an email blast to all environmental people in the organization. I don't really recommend this as the way to do it, because email, we all get so much email, we can't process it all, but it's an option. I'm just gonna wrap this so it doesn't hide. Expected actions. So what are people expected to do when they get this email or when they get this notification? So it might be like update their policies and their procedures. Now that's pretty vague and like high level. You would want to get into more detail than this, but I'm trying to just give some examples. And then internal reporting expectations. So, what are you expecting your team to report back? So they might report back like, yeah, I did it and I updated my procedures, or I did it, it's not applicable to me. And so you can say, email back confirming action. Now, again, I don't recommend emails. Software, Excel, definitely better. But if you don't have anything in place, email is a good starting point. And then, does this change require you to reevaluate the risk? So you might want to have a system in place where you determine, when you send out that notice, you might want people to reevaluate their risk related to this specific issue. Let's say you have an issue, a regulation around spill control plans. Well, perhaps you want them to reevaluate the risk of a spill with the new plan in place. So yes, you want them to reevaluate the risk. And other situations, you might not want them to reevaluate the risk, but these are just some tools. Of course, this is a spreadsheet. You can add and remove things from here. We tried to put in what we feel are the best practices and what we've seen over the years. But just identify, what are the sources, how frequently you plan to check for updates, and this will just help you stay on top of things. I put in things like court judgments, customer requests. You might want to, do a periodic scan of customers or investor requests, court rulings around some of your core issues. So you can build this list of sources that you want to check on a regular basis based on your organization, based on your industry. There's no one size fits all here, but you do want to have that periodic check. We've seen a lot of organizations that build a nice spreadsheet, they build a nice management system, but then they don't maintain it, right? And then it's not really worth much. So it's all about maintenance. So that is monitoring for changes, and then auditing for compliance. So you definitely need to have different types of audits. I think that is one message I want to send home, is that you got to have high-level management system audits, you need to have compliance audits, you need to have more regular safety walkthroughs, environmental walkthroughs, HR checks. I mean, it's just, there's so many moving parts in all of our businesses that you got to be checking at different levels at different frequencies. And so here you can link it back to the unique requirement. So let's just say, you know, we're going to go that sexual harassment example I gave earlier. Type of audit, so we can say it's an internal first-party audit, meaning like you're auditing yourself versus somebody coming from another facility, which would be a second-party audit. And then a third-party audit would be an external consulting company that comes in and does audit. So, so internal first-party audit, you can say unique audit numbers. So again, this is just the ability to track your audits over time. So you can say 2, 3, 4. I'm just inventing the number. Where's the location? So we can say we're going to do it at the Scranton location. Oh, sorry, it jumped. How frequent do you want this audit to happen? How frequently do we want this audit to happen? So let's say we do it annually, and let's jump again. And then effectiveness assessment. So if you have a policy, if you have requirements, you want to determine not just are the actions being taken, but are they effective? So perhaps in this audit for the sexual harassment one, you know, you do a training on sexual harassment on your policies. And so the training is done. So you've completed your action. The action was taken. It was the training. But then you want to determine, was it effective? And to determine if a training was effective, you could do a few things. I mean, you could do a quiz. You could do just an inspection of the workplace. You could ask people, you know, do you understand the policy? And so you can determine here that you want to do an effectiveness assessment as well. And maybe the outcome here is, you know, report to corporates and to HR. And that might be it's a small typo there, but you can do that. And then what's the risk of this audit? So like if this audit detects like a sexual harassment issue, you know, what is that? How important is that on your risk scale? So that's where you want to rank your audits, identify all the different types of audits and inspections you're going to do. I would say most companies don't do enough smaller audits and inspections. Like they bring in an external expert every 3 years. They do audits where they're walking around the facility and they're trying to pick up specific issues. Obviously on the finance side, you bring in external auditors, but there's a lot of problems that you can solve by just doing small periodic inspections, right? And it keeps everybody on their toes, and it forces people to really pay attention to it. For example, at Nimonik, we have an information security management system based on ISO 27001, and we do quarterly inspections of everybody's work environment, their computers, their systems, to ensure that they're respecting the information security management system, as well as a quiz, because you know people forget or people don't want to be bothered with certain things. So you got to do small regular inspections, as well as the big full comprehensive compliance audits. And you would want to outline in this page what are the different types of audits you're going to do, frequencies, locations, actions, things like that. I've listed like environmental walkthrough, pop quiz, assessment of training of staff, but you can put any type of audit you want in here. There's really no limit. And now with like tools like Nimonik, you can do it on mobile devices. You can pop open an app on your phone, answer a few questions, boom, 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 you're done. It doesn't need to be time consuming. But I do also want to recommend like your audit templates that you use for these different things should have specific requirements in them. Too often we see, especially more experienced auditors, say, oh, I don't need an audit template. I know what to look for. And they do, but nobody can remember everything that an organization needs to comply with. So that's where it's critical to have a checklist, to have a list of requirements, and use that not as a crutch, but rather as a reminder of what you should be checking for. And there's a fantastic book that I can put into the chat window here called The Checklist Manifesto. You might have heard of it before. It's by a doctor, and he talks about how checklists were critical to the aviation industry, as well as to doctors, to improving their performance. So having a very easy to use checklist that you use regularly has a huge impact. The example he cited was that at the Mayo Clinic, I believe, which is one of the world's best hospitals in the world, they implemented a pre-operation checklist and a post-operation checklist for putting lines into people when you're trying to inject like fluids and medicine. Anyways, the infection rate related to putting in lines using this checklist, it went down something like 65–70%. And this is at one of the best hospitals in the world. So having a very simple checklist has a huge impact. And we definitely recommend that, and then turning those into like basic audits and inspections. All right, so that's number 6. It's identifying all the different types of audits and inspections you're going to do, how frequently you're going to do them, effectiveness assessments you want to do, outcomes and risks. And the last step here is step 7. And so this is, you had to plan, do, check, act. So the 7 is kind of like you're coming back up and trying to improve your overall system. So, based on the action that you identify, let's say you do an audit, you find a non-compliance, you might want to link it back to the audit identification number, so you know exactly where it's coming from. Let's call it 234. That's what we had on the previous slide. Action tracking location. So where are you going to track this action to be completed? A lot of companies are still using Excel and email, which works, but you got to be organized. It could be a software, so it could be like Nimonik software. I'm just going to plug my own software because but you can use other software. Unique requirements. So does this non-compliance tie back to one of the unique requirements we found earlier? So if this one is about the sexual harassment issues, let's say it's a unique requirement is number 3. People don't understand the sexual harassment policy. And then let's say we did a training and we want to do an effectiveness assessment to determine whether or not the training has been effective. So in 6 months, we want to do a follow-up. And this is a practice that comes from the aviation industry. Aviation companies are required by law to do effectiveness assessments on their corrective actions. And then, what's the risk of this non-compliance? You can carry that over from the audit. And then also, were any new requirements identified? So often you do an inspection, you do an audit, you might pick up on new requirements that hadn't been identified in the first step, and that's where you kind of have that loop. And so if you identify a new requirement, maybe the requirement is doing like a second, sexual harassment training per year. So that could be a requirement that you want to set up to just make sure you get ahead of the curve. So this tab is designed to just have those actions that come out that are derived or brought out of your audits, and then you roll them back into your overall program and do follow-up. And it could be, government citation, it could be a corporate audit, it could be a training that went off the rails. So basically, just identify the different types of actions that you're going to have that you need to take action on. So that is the 7 steps at a very high level. Like I said, in a 1 to 2 day workshop, we would actually work with you to make these lists and to identify what you're already doing and then what you would like to do going forward. And if I come back to the general information tab, because we had skipped over the risk assessment portion here, but there is a little bit more information on the risk assessment where, we ask, have risk assessments been done in step 2? Step 2 is the requirements, so determine your risk of your different requirements. Have risk assessments been updated in step 5? So are you updating regularly your risk assessments based on changes? Step 5 is all about changes. And then have risk assessments been validated in step 6? So when you're out there doing the actual inspections, you want to determine, was the risk assessment that was done pretty good? Was it based on real facts of frequency, level of impact, things like that based on the operations? So those are just some risk assessment elements. And then, we have one here is like who's responsible for compliance in the supply chain. But I think you have to personalize this. You can't just take our spreadsheet or what I'm saying today and kind of copy paste. If you could, it'd probably be nice, but it has to be a personalized compliance program that's really tailored to your business, to your reality, to your company culture. And that's hopefully what I've shared today helps. But it's all about a structured approach that's interlinking, right? Where you have obligations. If we come back to the core here, if we just we've gone into a bit of detail, take a step back and we look at the simple version. it's all about what are my obligations, what are my actions, how am I going to audit it to determine if the actions were taken and if they were effective. And I would say, this is the slide you kind of got to hammer home with your management because it's simple. I think everybody would high level agree with this. And you just got to hammer this home and say, this is what we got to do. I need the resources to do it. I need the time to do it. And then, of course, you have to go into the details and do the hard work of identifying all of this. But at the end of the day, this is what it's all about. And we're big believers in Nimonik that if your organization takes compliance seriously, if you do a proper analysis of your requirements, you will have way less problems. You'll have less worker injuries, less environmental issues, less financial issues. And it is an investment, not a cost. But there is an educational ROI kind of debate, not debate, but education that you need to do with your upper management. And we're happy to help you do that. We have some materials to help you, but we're big believers that this is where modern organizations are headed post 2020. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. We ended about 20 minutes early because we didn't have a ton of volunteers to step up, but no problem. Does anybody have any other questions or comments or things that that you would like to share? There will be a survey when you exit. I should have mentioned this earlier, but if you exit the webinar, there's a survey. Your feedback is super appreciated. We're always trying to improve. I'm trying to improve. So any feedback you have on today's webinar would be really greatly appreciated. And it should be a 2 or 3 question survey. Feel free to jump and pop in a couple more questions. And then I want to just ask, I have a poll here, which is, I'm kind of curious, we could have done this at the beginning, but still curious, are you directly responsible for compliance at your organization? Just getting a sense of like, how many of you are, the buck stops with you when it comes to compliance versus how many of you maybe have a foot in compliance, but you're not directly responsible for it. So just kind of curious about that. And while we're waiting for that, if anybody has questions, please drop them into the questions tab here. So can a health and safety officer be a compliance officer in one organization? Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think whether it's health and safety, environment, finance, HR, it comes back to these 3 things, right? It's like, what do you got to do? What are the actions and audit? So you already have the foundational understanding of that by being a health and safety officer, and you can also be a compliance officer in the organization. I guess you do need to look at like, where do you sit within the organization? Who do you report to? And how do you get your message brought to the higher levels? Because if you're like a local compliance officer at a specific plant, there's a limit to the impact you can have. So you gotta do that initial general information assessment, figure out where you sit in the organization, but yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, you don't need a degree in nuclear science to do this. You just need to be disciplined. So that's Penwell. Thank you, Penwell, for your question. Where in Canada are you located, and do you have other offices in Canada? We are based in Montreal. We do have colleagues in Toronto, and we're traveling regularly across the country. So let us know where you're based, Rick, and perhaps we can meet up. We also have offices in China, partners down in the States that we work with, and in Europe as well. So we're all over the place, but happy to meet up. So Tim says, thank you very much for the information. I have to get back to the grind. All right, Tim, thank you for coming. And can you mention what was the book you referred to at the beginning of the session about failure? So it was called, Run to Failure. And let me just, it's in the chat. It's in the chat window. If you scroll up a couple messages, you should see a link to Amazon. So it's this book here called Run to Failure, which is really interesting book, fairly technical. I mean, in terms of it goes into the details, but it goes through BP, through their leaks and non-compliance issues in the Alaskan North Slope, to the Texas City refinery that blew up. This was around 2007, I think. And then to the Deepwater Horizon disaster, which was, I guess, 2010 or so. But it just goes into like the culture that was at BP, which was extremely cost-driven and led to all these disasters. And then the other book I mentioned, which I also recommend, is the Checklist Manifesto, which is this one right here. And this one is a shorter read. and it's by Atul Gawande, who's a surgeon in the US, a very great guy, great writer. And this just runs through, the power of checklists in the aviation industry, the medical industry. I think he also covers the food and beverage industry. And it's just, to me, you can, give this to a lot of your managers, just show them that a simple checklist can have a huge impact on performance, even for highly trained people like doctors. Okay, so we had a poll going, are you directly responsible for compliance? And 65%, I'll share that, 65% say yes, 25% say no, 10% are unsure. So I'd be curious to know, I put that in there this morning, just saying like, how can you be unsure of something that's so important? But anyways, I'm kind of curious to know why you're unsure, and perhaps that's something you should clarify with your managers. All right. Another question. Yeah. So the templates, we'll send everything out by email as well as recording. And then Stephanie here is saying, for a startup company of about 10 employees, where do you recommend we start our compliance journey? Good question, Stephanie. I'd say it comes back to like, keep it simple, stupid. It's like, it depends what your business is. I think I saw on your email the type of business you had, but I don't want to presume. So if you want to let us know the type of startup you're doing, that'd be great. Obviously, you're going to have to take into consideration the industry you're in. So, if you're in the tech sphere, you might need to look at like data privacy. That's a huge thing where you got to be in compliance now with GDPR, with different data privacy requirements around the world. California has a whole bunch. So if you're in the tech space, if you're in a manufacturing space, you want to make sure that your workers are like safe, and maybe safety is a priority, safety compliance. So you got to look at your individual situation, but I'd say simple, and then culture. Like you want to get the culture right from the get-go. Especially you have the chance here to like start a new business, which is awesome. Congratulations. It's not easy. It's a lot of fun, but get the culture right from the start. And implement some basic checklists on the core high-risk activities you have based on the type of business you're in, and just regular trainings, retrainings, things like that. It's about culture. If you get the culture right, a lot of the rest will follow. But culture alone is not enough. Don't get me confused. I don't want to confuse anybody. But start simple. Focus on the high-risk things for your business based on your industry, and then culture. So training. Just getting information security management systems implemented in at Nimonik was a lot of work. A lot of people who are less tech savvy, information security management is not something they're very interested in. So we had to do a lot of education about the importance of information security management. And I could do a whole webinar on that. Maybe I will actually. Yeah. So culture, education. Pick the high risk activities that are tied to your core business. If we, like for Nimonik, if we don't have a robust information security management system, businesses won't buy our service, right? Because our customers expect us to keep their information secure. And so we have to go through a whole bunch of like hoops and loops to get to do that. So that's very important for us because it's tied to our core business. So I would say that's my very long answer to your question. Okay, great. Well, congratulations, everybody. I think we still got like 92 people on the call. So thank you so much for sticking with us for almost 2 hours here. This is, I know this can be long and challenging. So I really appreciate everybody's time this morning for coming out and for sticking with us till the end. Does anybody have any other questions? We're gonna send, we'll resend the materials. We will send the video by email. If you have questions or if you'd like a one-day workshop with us directly, shoot us an email. info@nimonik.com. And we did an email blast last week with 5 powerful questions for assessing compliance at your organization. I think I have them. Let me see if I have them. Let me just copy paste them here. We can conclude on, so I'm trying to do this from memory now, but it's about assessing. It comes back to the general high level stuff. It's like, if you want to take one thing away from this workshop, let me just go pull up the questions. Give me 1 second. And give me 1 second. I'm going to go get the questions, and so that way I don't have to just do it from memory. So it was these 5 compliance questions here. And so if you want to do, the Excel spreadsheet is pretty big, to be fair. So if you want to have 5 questions that you can take and use with your team, use with your management, I would say it's these 5. Like, do you understand your compliance obligations? Does your team have the competence to stay in compliance? And you can ask this to your management as well as to all the other teams. Are there controls in place to meet your compliance obligations? So if we, steps like say 3 to 7 are controls in a sense. If we wrap that all into like, are there controls to meet compliance obligations? Do you do audits to control for effectiveness and use? And in your opinion, and you can ask people this, what is the probability of a non-compliance to your requirements in your department, right? So you go to your environment department and say, hey, between you and me, what's the probability that we have non-compliances right now related to environment? And that will give you a sense of how ready they are for an audit, external audit, how ready they are for a management report. And so you just ask these 5 questions. I'd say it could be a good instigator to get your compliance program going. All right, screen is not available. Oh, did I lose my screen share? Let me turn my screen back on. Okay, well, what I'll do is I will copy these questions into the chat window. So that way, if you want to have a copy of them, copy paste them into an email or something that you're going to use, you can do that. So I'm going to put them into the chat window. And they also went out by email last week. So hopefully, there you go. The questions are now in the chat window. You can grab those and use those as you see fit. So I think that's pretty much everything. That's pretty much everything I want to share today. Does anybody have any last-minute questions, clarifications, comments? If it's something more, one-on-one, you want to have an individual discussion due to confidentiality, please don't hesitate to send us an email, info@nimonik.com, or my personal email is jbrun@nimonik.com. I will put that in the chat window. And info@nimonik.com. We'll send all the information after the webinar. And thank you so much for attending. And I wish everybody a very great and compliant day. And hope we get to connect soon in the future. All right, great. Have a great day, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.